Oh, I see the next one. Yes.
Shall we come?
Hello, I'm Sally Beamish. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
And I'm very fortunate that my music is being done here over 3 days. I've got to meet the students and hear their pieces and rehearse with them playing and hear their music. So it's been really interesting and fun. And I noticed that the pieces that have been chosen for this evening have a kind of theme, which is that they all tell stories. So I thought I'd talk about the element of storytelling in my music, which has really been there right from the beginning. I was born in London into a musical family. My mother was a violinist, and she taught me to read and write music when I was 4 years old. So in a way, it was my first language because I wasn't reading and writing yet. So my instinct was to use that new language to create stories. And the first things I wrote in my little manuscript book that my mum gave me, I drew pictures of faces and flowers onto the stage, and then she would play them back to me. So that was how I learnt the correlation between the lines, the spaces, and the sound that would come out. I think the result of that was that I never learned to play by ear or to improvise, but I was a really good reader right from the beginning. And my early pieces, I started composing straight away. As soon as I had these tools, I started composing, and my earliest pieces were very often settings of texts. I wrote an opera, O-P-R-A, when I was 7 or so, to a Paul Gallico story. I was very interested in the stage. My paternal aunt was a singer and actor, and she was in the first production of Sound of Music in the West End, which she took me to, and I sat on my own in the auditorium and watched. I was just completely captivated by anything that involved costume and drama. And I think that's really stayed with me in my music. So the pieces that are going to be played are Spell, which is the most recent one, and that's a piano quartet. And the brief for that commission from a festival in Austria was actually to write something based on the writings of Joseph Campbell, who described the hero's journey, and I decided to make that the story of the piece. So it very much exactly tells the story. Songs and Blessings, which was one of the very first pieces I wrote when I got to Scotland, and is based on the sort of lore, the Gaelic songs and psalms and prayers, which are all in the form of this beautiful poetry. And so again, it was very much to do with words and writing. And The King's Alchemist, which is a crazy story about, I think you'll have a programme, but it's a crazy story about an alchemist who worked in the court of the king in Stirling Castle in the 1500s, and decided the king from the fact that he wasn't actually making gold from base metals. He decided to distract the king by attempting a flight from the battlements of the castle to France. And he made it as far as the midden, the rubbish tip, and broke his leg. I just loved the story. I thought it was so colourful. I decided to play the viola as the most likely way to earn a living. I knew I wanted to compose, but it didn't occur to me that I could earn a living by doing it. So I studied viola. I entered the London freelance scene, and through that met so many players who have remained part of my life, who've commissioned works, some of them have become conductors and continued commissioning. And one of those very first pieces was Commedia, which is based on the Commedia dell'arte. So I've made an imaginary story from the Commedia dell'arte with Pulcinella and Piero and Columbine. And it was a quintet, and I gave each character an instrument. And that character just was that instrument and played their material, and the material was altered according to what the character was feeling. So it was very, very literal. But it helped me to make a structure and to know exactly what I was doing. It was really important to me to know why I was writing particular notes, to work with themes and to use them very precisely. And it was a long, long time before I dared just to improvise onto the page. That came much later. At the beginning I was really working things out. And another chance I had was to set some poems by the Ukrainian poet Irina Ratushinskaya. This was in the 80s, and I was asked to write in fact I wasn't asked to do a setting, I was asked to write background music for readings of the poems, and I asked if I could make it into a cohesive piece of music, and so produced my first sort of lengthy piece of 20 minutes, and that gave me huge confidence. Again, using words, so I had each poem with its kind of setting, but for actor, and then an interlude in between, which reflected on that. So that gave me my structure. When I moved to Scotland in 1990, I was already beginning to get commissions. I stopped playing around that time, and never having studied composition, I was pretty unprepared for producing works to a deadline, and I didn't have a great deal of confidence. But the experience of working with the Ukrainian poems made me realise that just to have some words there was really important to me. And there's a beautiful poem by Sylvia Plath called Winter Trees. And I had a commission to write for the Partling Group, violin and piano. I decided, I knew I wouldn't get copyright permission from Sylvia Plath, we still can't. But I set her words for violin and piano. So using the words as a template, but of course you don't hear the words. So I knew exactly what I was wanting to do with every note, because it represented a word from the poem. So it was a way of constructing music, which has really remained with me, actually, and also arriving in Scotland, just being completely bowled over by the landscape. And so that was another thing that really came into my music, and the presence of music in everyday life, which I didn't ever really have a sense of in London. It was the feeling that music was part of every event, that you went to the pub and there were people playing together. There was a dance every week in the village hall, and everyone came to that dance. You know, it wasn't just a certain section of the society. It was the grandparents right down through the teenagers to the babies, and they were all there, and it was totally cool to be there. And everyone learnt the dances at school, so it also took away the sheer embarrassment that I would have experienced at a disco, you know, of having to sort of dance and not know what you were doing. So I loved the atmosphere of the ceilidh, and and the music was the key to that somehow. So I was suddenly writing a lot of music. It was a fantastic place to be for a composer. Scotland is a small country. It made links with other small countries. When I first arrived in Scotland, there was an exchange with Iceland, and they sent a team over looking for a composer who'd never written for orchestra to give them the chance to write for the Iceland Symphony Orchestra. And I got the gig as being the least likely to succeed, probably. I'd never even written for brass or percussion, and I had to write a symphony. And again, I went to my fallback of using text. I made a setting of Psalm 104, a wordless setting, and that's the psalm that's all about celebration of landscape and of the earth, really, and that's what I was feeling at the time. So, and it's also full of imagery. So that was a kind of gift. But then, you can take away the text, nobody needs to know about it. The very first program note I wrote for that piece had an incredibly detailed, I'd written out the whole psalm and I'd explained, and there's the oboe and there's the bassoon, and that's when the percussion comes in. And it was so distracting for the audience because they were saying, well, which bit is that, and not listening. So I learned quite early on that less is more when it comes to the program note. You just take that away, and if the piece should stand up on its own, probably. The first piece I'm going to play you is, again, it's a setting of a lullaby, an African lullaby. I was asked by the University of Glasgow to write a piece for a retiring professor of zoology, and his speciality had been research into sleeping sickness, which is more or less confined to Central Africa. So I did a lot of research. His daughter was a harpist, and she was actually living in America, but we decided to bring her back secretly, and she was going to play this piece. So she was behind a screen, and the screen was wheeled back, and there she was. And actually, it was a scary moment because he went absolutely white, and I thought he might faint or something. But he was so shocked to see her because he had no idea that she was in Scotland. And I researched that I was taken to the lab to look at the tsetse flies, at the trypanosomes, which are the microorganisms that cause the disease. And the reason it's so difficult to treat is because they change their coats. These cells change their coats, and as soon as you find something to kill them, they change. And so it's almost impossible to get on top of the disease. But I was shown these under the microscope and the way they move, and the tsetse flies as well. And I listened to African kora playing, and I found a lullaby. And this section that I'm going to play you of the piece, you'll see the lullaby on the screen, and hear my setting of it. So now I've got to learn how to do this. I think I press this. Yes. And then if I press it again, this is a section of Awuya, and it's played by Anne Denham.
I was trying to capture the idea of the changing cells, and also, as you saw, the movement of the flies in the music. So all the sort of visual stuff was there as well. And that poem, that lullaby, it didn't specifically say that it was to do with a mother who had sleeping sickness, but the symptoms are just absolutely textbook symptoms of sleeping sickness, of not being able to do anything. So the next piece I'm going to play is very clearly influenced by being in Scotland, and in fact it was a commission from the Scottish Ensemble for Lawrence Power, a viola concerto, and the Scottish Ensemble phoned me up. I hadn't started writing the piece, and I should have done, but they phoned me up while I was on a course, a harp course with my daughter who plays the Scottish harp, and we'd just been in a workshop about Celtic textile workers' songs, and we'd been learning these songs and things. Anyway, I had this phone call asking me for a program note, and I hadn't started the piece. But this is something that I've found quite useful, actually, is to write the program note. If I don't know what to do, I write the story first, and then I write the piece. You could take that a step further and write the reviews as well, give yourself a bit of confidence, you know. Marvellous way she used the viola. Anyway, so this, I said it was going to be about the songs of textile workers on the Isle of Harris. And so I was stuck with that, and I went back and did some research, and I had this marvellous book called Carmina Gadelica, which is a collection of Gaelic songs and psalms from the Highlands and Islands, which was made in the 1800s, translated into English, and full of the most beautiful songs and prayers. But this was a story, and it was from the time of the Glencoe massacre, and apparently a true story, that after the massacre in, I think, 1692, the people were trying to escape, and they were going out into the snow. It was in January, and a lot of people died in the snow trying to escape the troops. And an officer in the government troop heard a child crying, a baby crying, and dispatched a soldier to kill the baby. And the soldier went, and he heard the mother singing a lullaby to her baby, and they were dying in the snow. And one of the lines from the lullaby is, "Alone am I under the wing of the rock, angels calling me home." So it was she just thought they were going to die, and this was her way of praying. But the melody she sang was a melody that the soldier had heard before he'd left home to join the army, and he took pity on them and gave them all his food and gave them his plaid, his coat, and they survived. And the story is that descendants of that mother and baby are still living in the region, and it was absolutely a true story. So I found that really moving, and I thought I'd like to create that kind of atmosphere of cold, of hearing a voice across the snow. I didn't know what the tune had been of this lullaby, but I imagined it. And at the same time, when I was writing this piece, I heard the American saxophonist Branford Marsalis playing a piece of mine, and I was very taken by his sound, and I listened to his jazz playing a lot, and it began to creep into this viola concerto, his sound and a lot of jazz influence. And in fact, when Lawrence had premiered it, I arranged it for Branford, and he's recorded it twice now. So it's also a saxophone concerto. But I think I'm going to play you actually Branford playing the opening of it, which is trying to conjure up the snow-covered Glencoe. Now. What am I doing wrong? Franco? This should be changing. Is he there? Sorry, I'm pressing the one you told me to press, but nothing's happening. Is it this one? So what was I doing wrong? Press it harder. it then goes into a much faster section, which uses the textile workers' songs. The story theme kind of continues through a lot of pieces. In 2012, I was asked to be one of the composers for the Olympics, and the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment asked me to write a piece connected in some way to sport. And I couldn't think of any sport that had... A friend of mine was a marvellous horsewoman, and in fact riding was something I had done as a child. And she lived in my village. And she had had an appalling accident and broken her neck and back and had become totally paralysed about a year before. And she is Melanie Reid, who writes Spinal Column in the Times, and it's still going 15 years later. A very inspirational woman and a wonderful writer. And I thought I'd like to do something with her. And I asked her if she would write a text for me. And the first thing she said, being a journalist, was, "When's the deadline?" And I said, "Well, I think May." And she said, "Oh, I thought you were going to say Friday." And she started writing, and she sent me something, and she'd kind of gone all poetic on me, you know, and it wasn't really the way she writes in the Times. And I said, no, I just want you to write in the way that you normally write. And it's not going to be sung, it's just going to be spoken. And she came up with this fantastic text. And I asked her for a title, and she called it Spinal Chords. She said, after all, I'm a journalist. But that idea of chords was my starting point for the piece. And I remember sitting down at the piano and just improvising a set of chords, of 12 chords, and they became the basis of the piece. And in fact, one of the pieces you'll hear later, April, uses a very similar idea of almost like a chaconne of developing a set of chords. In this case, it starts with the chords being totally fragmented, and the idea is that the piece brings them back together, because she was writing about the healing process of her body, of her nervous system. And in fact, it is an optimistic piece, but sadly the optimism didn't come to anything really, and she has remained pretty much the same. So she finds the piece very, very painful to listen to now. At the time, it seemed that there was a chance that she could get some movement back. And Juliet Stevenson narrated it and became a great friend of Melanie's and also of mine. So that was very, very special to work with her. Yes. And so this is a clip from Spinal Chords with the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment and Juliet.
So I begin rehabilitation. I begin to ride this ghastly, non-compliant new horse, which bucks and throws me contemptuously time and time and time again. I learn a new definition of slowness. Tomorrow and tomorrow creeps on this stinking, petty pace from day to day. I remember the milestones. The first time I pushed myself back to the ward from the gym in my wheelchair. 50 feet for some, a marathon for me. The first time I sit myself up in the gym from a lying position. The first time I transfer from my chair without a hoist. I remember the bathos of my punctured arrogance. Doesn't anyone realize there's been some mistake? I am the mistress of my universe. I shouldn't be here. The ever-present black humor. How those of us with high neck injuries congregate for hand therapy in the manner of elderly tortoises, nodding and muttering to mid-air as we cannot turn our heads to make eye contact.
So that was an example of a title giving me an idea of how to write the piece and basing it on these chords and building the chords through the piece so that in the way that nerves might reconnect in a body. The next piece that I'm going to play you is very much to do with Scotland, although I didn't expect it to be. In 2016, I think it was, I was coincidentally asked to write 3 piano concertos by 3 different pianists. And I had sort of in the years before, I'd sort of said yes to all of them, but I thought, well, they won't all happen. And then they did all happen, and they all happened in the same year. So that year was just dedicated to writing 3 piano concertos. And luckily, each pianist came with a very clear idea of what they wanted, and also all the orchestrations were different. So the first one was with strings, the second one with symphony orchestra, and the third one with chamber orchestra. And I'm going to play you part of the first one. I wanted to do 3 aspects of landscape, if you like. So the first one is very much about mountains. The second one is about water. It was Martin Roscoe who commissioned the second one, and he took me out to the Corrie Vrecken whirlpool off the west coast of Scotland, which is one of the most dangerous stretches of water off the UK, because he wanted me to write about Corrie Vrecken. And the title translates as Cauldron of the Speckled Seas, which I thought was wonderful, and so that's the name of the piece. And it was an unforgettable experience. And then the third one, Jonathan Biss asked me to write a piece connected to the Beethoven First Piano Concerto. He commissioned a set of 5 concertos to go with the 5 Beethovens, and he asked me to do number 1. And that was a challenge, obviously, in itself, you know, to take Beethoven and to do something with that. But in that case, I hadn't met him before, and we had a brief meeting about the piece, and then I was trying to get in touch with him, and he simply wasn't getting back to me. And it turned out that he'd had a kind of breakdown following the first Trump election. He was so horrified that he just went off the radar totally, and he stopped playing for a while. He'd stopped answering emails, and it seemed to me that was my cue for the piece, really, to write about that, to write about the way the world was going, in a way, and the sort of cynicism of war and the development of weapons being what leads our technology. And so the piece, instead of being a celebration I was going to make it a celebration of man's creativity, and instead of that it became a kind of grotesque parody of the Beethoven. So that was my story of the piece. It was a protest, really. And the amazing thing was that it was premiered actually simultaneously with Trump's inauguration. It was in the morning, and it was in America, in St. Paul. And my publisher said, you mustn't say what it's about. And then the orchestra was saying, you have to say what it's about. And I did. And it was an amazing experience, and I felt that the audience were really with me. And I remember hearing the leader, as he went off the stage, saying, well, the Titanic went down, but the musicians kept playing. There was a real sense of kind of devastation in a way. So that was the second and the third concerto. The one I'm going to play is the first one, which was written for Ronald Broutigam, who's a Dutch pianist. And unexpectedly, he said he wanted a piece about the Cairngorms. His wife comes from that area of Scotland, and he goes there several times a year and absolutely loves it, and he wanted a piece to reflect that. And I had just come across this amazing book called The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd. It's beautiful writing, prose about walking in the Cairngorm Mountains. And so I wrote this four-movement piece, each based on a chapter of that book. Although this last movement, it's about the weather, it's about, you can hear the thunder coming across the valleys, but it's also about a story of three tailors who challenged each other to dance in three different spots in the Cairngorms, and to walk in between, then to dance, then to walk to the next one. And this was all, it was a kind of a bet, I think, for them to do it, and they all died of exposure. So I thought that was, it was just a really startling story. And because they were tailors, I based this last movement on the tune, The Deal Among the Tailors, which is a beloved Scottish tune. And I think you'll be able to hear, the tune is da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-dum, that one. And I've sort of subverted it into a kind of crazy dance movement. Like Spinal Chords, this piece was written knowing that there would be no conductor. So that's another thing to take into account. I'm always so grateful that I'm working to commission, because there are always boundaries, there are always things that I have to think about. There's the scoring, obviously, is there. The length of the piece is given to me, often an idea, as in this piece. And, if I'm told sometimes there won't be a conductor, so can you make sure that you write it so that it can be done without a conductor? And as you saw in Spinal Chords, Chichi, the bass player, was conducting certain passages, and I made it so that it would be co-directed by the leader and the bass player. And in this case, it's co-directed by Daniel Bard is leading the orchestra, the pianist, Alistair Beatson, so it's not actually Ronald, this performance, and I'm playing principal viola and directing from the viola as well. And it was one of the very first things I did when I returned to viola playing in 2016, and I was totally useless. All I could do was play the viola part. I was completely a waste of space when it came to people asking me about the score or, what note should I have there. My head was completely back in the viola. It was really interesting, actually. And I don't know how people do that, how people play and direct at the same time or play their own music. Because I was in the sort of space where I would sort of think, why haven't the violas come in? And then realizing that I was one of them. I was so used to, about that time, to sitting in the auditorium in a rehearsal with my score, walking around, thinking, leafing through the score, going back, going forward, and just really taking in what was happening on the stage. But actually being part of the music was a really new experience. So this is the last movement. Yeah, so that was a challenge. You could hear that was a real challenge to get together with no conductor. I think it has been done with conductor since, but it was fun. It was fun being inside the piece myself. So of course the ultimate storytelling for a composer might be to write for dance. And having sort of grappled with text and words many times and not ever really feeling I'd found the ideal way to set them, whether to use them as spoken words, classical voices, choirs, folk voices, music theatre voices, they're all different animals altogether. And it's very often unsatisfactory because you don't always hear the text. I think music theatre gets the closest because it's with a microphone and the voice is much more sort of used in a natural way. You hear the personality of the singer in character. And so in opera, I always feel if someone starts to speak and they're suddenly on a microphone and you're sort of thinking, where did that come from? It doesn't sound anything like the person who was just singing. So I think music theatre gets quite close to continuing the narrative of the character through song and then through dialogue. But in dance, you don't have to worry about text at all. It's just not there, and you are really centre stage, quite literally. You get to tell the story. And one of, I think, the highlights of my life has been working with the choreographer David Bintley. The first ballet we did, and the first ballet I'd ever done. I'd always wanted to, but I think I was 60 by the time he got in touch. We did The Tempest together, which was just pure joy working on that. And then he asked me to do A Christmas Carol, Dickens. In fact, he sent me an email saying, could I think of a composer who might do A Christmas Carol with him? He needed a composer who would write a family ballet, who would basically not frighten the horses. You know, the music would be Christmassy, accessible, using Christmas carols, Victorian street music and whatever. And could I think of anyone? And I was a little bit offended that he hadn't asked me. And I said to Peter, what shall I do? Because I would really love to do this. And do you think he knows that I could probably do this? And he said, well, why don't you just write back to him and say, would you consider me? So I did that. And by return, I got an email saying that was the correct answer. So it was his way of saying, I'm going to take away your contemporary classical voice and you're going to have to do what I need you to do in this ballet. And it was just heaven for me because I didn't have to worry about anything. I knew exactly what he wanted. We had a meeting every week on Zoom. I was able to send him audio playback of the orchestral score. And so we were really working together. There was a real sort of to and fro of ideas. And I'm going to play you a clip that I'm particularly proud of because occasionally I would have an idea about something dramatic on stage, and he would think it was a good idea. And in this case, there's a sequence where you see the funeral of Tiny Tim, first of all, and then you see Scrooge's coffin coming in. And I suggested that there should be a dance in the graveyard. I actually imagined skeletons or something, and I said, could I have an on-stage fiddler? And none of that was accepted, but what he's done, I think, is incredible. So this is music that was written for the graveyard scene, and it leads up, it's the very end of Christmas Future, and it then leads into Christmas morning when Scrooge wakes up and finds that he has a chance to make everything okay. might have picked up that most of that music is based on Christmas carols, which was quite fun to do. So there's Lule Lule, Thou Little Tiny Child, for Tim's funeral, and then most of that is based on Deck the Halls with Boughs of Holly, and God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. And then you heard Sir Roger de Coverley as well, which is the one dance that Dickens mentions at Fezziwig's party. So I've used that earlier in the ballet. So it was quite fun subverting that. The interesting thing about writing for ballet is that you have to make the beat clear. There has to be a way for the dancers to know where they are. And it's quite extraordinary the way dancers count, because they're not usually musically trained. And so David will be saying to them, right, you go from the 13 count. We're just going from the 13 count. And I'm thinking, what's that? You know, and it's sort of several bars, but that's the way they count. They just count to 13 and then they know they have to move. It's really extraordinary. So if they can't hear any sense of beat coming from the pit, then they're lost. And so the challenge of making 2 hours of music where you can always hear where the beat is quite a big challenge, and for it not to be dull. And that's something that made me think a lot about the importance of rhythm and meter in music and whether or not it's audible. But for me, writing ballet has been absolutely the pinnacle of composing. I've absolutely loved it and longing to do more. And of course, I suppose it's a bit like writing film music, but without being able to see the pictures. But the difference is that you don't have to keep out of the way of the dialogue. So you really can do whatever you want. And it's just huge fun to do. So that was all about storytelling. This evening you'll hear 3 stories, and also April, which was a little memorial piece written in memory of Branford Marsalis' father, who died at the beginning of COVID. Ellis Marsalis, who was a wonderful educator and jazz pianist. Interestingly, this is the first time that this will have been played with an improvisational element, because I wrote it so that it could be done in that way. In fact, it was a lockdown piece that was written for a group of young musicians who had no playing, and something was set up for them to be able to record remotely. And the combination of instruments was saxophone, percussion, and piano. And I thought that would be quite difficult. And then when Ellis died, I thought, of course, this is the piece in memory of him. So I've used vibraphone, which Branford's brother Jason plays. And it's, as I said before, it's based on a set of chords, a chaconne. And they are going to do 2 plays of it where they are just completely improvising. So that's been fantastic to be able to do it like that. So for me, just to be able to work with these young musicians and hear their work and hear their take on my work has been a real gift. And thank you to everyone for inviting me. And look forward to speaking to everyone, and I hope you enjoy the music this evening. Thank you.